Welcome, Penny Pepper. Together 2012 commissioned you to write a new piece of creative non-fiction to commemorate Holocaust Memorial Day 2026, which has the theme of bridging generations. Your work, The Dark Door Opening, has now been published on our website, and it's very powerful and thought-provoking. Today, not enough people know about the 250,000 disabled people of all backgrounds who were murdered by the Nazis, but you learned about it when you were a child at primary school. Can you tell me how that came about?
It came about almost by chance, I suppose, but the fact that I did have a Jewish teacher, primary school, junior school, in special needs education back in the 60s, it was very, very vague in how you were defined in your year. So my teacher, who I refer to as Miss J, I didn't know what being Jewish meant or being Muslim meant or anything. I didn't even have a concept of racism, which I have written about elsewhere. Um, but the irony being, at a special school, you tended to be herded off miles away from your home. Sometimes you were in boarding schools. At that point, I was lucky I could still go home every day. Um, but my teacher, Miss J, was a delightful person. And as I approached 9 or 10, she did tell me, I don't remember it being a classroom event. I remember her telling me in a fairly low key event about how the Holocaust affected disabled people. And I imagine that some of my memories might be an embellishment of time, but I think that's true for all of us. But I remember the shock and I remember the specifics, which is that the Nazis killed disabled children and that there were bad people in the world. And that was when I feel that that was a growing up moment, a moment of dawning awareness of the world not being such a great place.
Yeah, I mean, you say in your piece of writing you'd already lost your father, and I lost my father when I was at school, and I had a real sense from that of understanding death in a way that the other people in the class didn't. Do you think that helped you to understand the full horror of what she was talking about?
I think it helped me understand, in a sense, the reality of death, but also with an added horror. Um, in that I'd lost my father through a chance occurrence with a sudden brain trauma, and he died in his sleep, but he was 29. And I remember the day vividly that happened. And he was a very loving dad, a very interesting person that I've picked up over the years. And there's all kinds of those memory overlaps and an internal movie sort of sensation where you remember this piece and then you've probably expanded that piece or that doorway. And I like analogies around doorways, partly because so many of them for us are not accessible. But in terms of my memory, it feels ultimately very accessible. And it's a treasure that I have very strong memories of certain events. So I think I became aware of death very early, even before that, because I became ill as a child. And I remember being in hospital around the age of 5. And I've put this in my memoir just to throw in a little plug there. In First in the World Somewhere, I do detail how I remembered I lived through death from around the age of 5 because disabled children died. What I wasn't prepared for. I processed that at such a young age. The kid in the bed next to you might die of bronchitis. I remember a kid always having a cough and the nurses whispering that he probably wouldn't make it, and I had no real concept of what that meant. And I was quite mobile. I was ill, but I was mobile. So I was always in trouble and nosy and curious child. But then in fact, it was my first girl crush. I had a terrible girl crush, someone called Laura, and she had diabetes. I didn't know what that meant. I remember struggling to think how you spelt that. And then one day she wasn't there anymore. She died. And I couldn't have been more than 6. And so that was a dawning again of some realization. And by the time I'm at the school where Miss J worked, of course, this is another level. Not only is there the horror of and realization of death right up close, but now there's the realization that people murder other people, other children, because of some definition of who they are. It was beyond the cliche of life-changing. It was an awakening.
And one of the things that I found so interesting about the piece is that it's, you've written in other places, and I think most recently at Christmas, about your childhood and your time in hospital and your time in special school. But I haven't seen these references before. This is really something quite new that you're disclosing to your audience, isn't it?
It is new, and it's been a tricky path to reveal these things, partly because there's an expectation that the only stories we have are memoir. And I've always resisted that. I think there's a danger of narrowing your scope. And I'm sure you know, Ju, we've known each other a long time, but my big passion is to bring the disability narrative into fiction. And why? Because fiction can transmute and expose and provoke within, hopefully, the power of being a reasonably good writer. That direct memoir doesn't always. So but recently there has been a rise in this form of writing called narrative nonfiction, where you can tell a story in a story format that has the memoir aspect to it. And I'm quite drawn to that. And I don't think any writer or storyteller should narrow their options, particularly disabled people, who still feature in a minute level, if at all, within that world. So I'm quite happy to do that. There'll be a lot more coming of that nature. One of the interesting, not diversions, but routes I'm going to take, I suppose, is I'm very interested in folklore and folk horror. And I am working now on a novella, which is a folk horror based novella, but the main protagonist is a disabled woman. Not me. This is the other thing. Whenever you write a character, people always assume it's related to you. But they wouldn't ask that to. I think there is a bit of misogyny in this. I think you don't get asked that if you're a sort of white male of a certain privileged background,
I'm sure that's true. I mean, one of the things that strikes me about this particular piece of writing at this moment in time is that the Holocaust is subject to so many fictions that trying to get back to this very raw, brutal reality has become really important. And I would also say that the theme of bridging generations also extends to disabled people. Our stories were never told when we were young. You know,
No.
young disabled people today are going through things that we went through and really unaware of what might have, yeah, any of their history or indeed any of the tools they might use to challenge that oppression. So the idea that we could also share our stories of memories of being children in hospital, how we were treated in school, all of these different things I think are really important. But I think the other thing that struck me when they announced the theme of bridging generations is that we as disabled people have never had Holocaust survivors as role models for very sad reasons, which is that those disabled people of all ages who survived the Holocaust were left in institutions. There were, their lives were not documented, their names were not recorded, many of their experiences just disappeared from history. So we don't have that direct knowledge. And I was so struck by the fact that you were taught about what happened to disabled children in the Holocaust, not as part of any kind of disability history, but because,
Yeah.
as you say, you had the sort of chance fortune to be taught
Yeah.
by a Jewish teacher, and also
Yeah.
a Jewish teacher who I think would have been very brave
Yeah. I
sharing
imagine.
stories.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wish that it was only much later, of course, that I realised what that meant and what that must have meant for her. And at least her family must have been survivors of the Holocaust, in that she was there in a special school teaching us and giving me value. I think that's also very important, that she gave me a sense of valuing my own story that was ready to unfurl, um, and became one of those. I've been lucky with people like that, with teachers, that they became the focus points of hope. I had a troubled childhood at home. Family life was difficult after my dad had died. I didn't live anywhere particularly um, accessible. And I mean that in both senses, because it was a very rural community on the Buckinghamshire, Hertfordshire borders of the Chiltern Hills. And we were very working class. There was no expectation at that point that I would ever get a full education. I think that shocks people now. I don't really know. Obviously, I know a little about how those things have moved or moved on, and I know there's much work about avoiding segregated education. I still maintain it's not a good thing, but it can't be done without proper funding or support to free disabled children to do it. It just can't. You can't just force it into an existing model. It won't. It just won't work. And I've got younger friends who've been on that journey of just. I mean, I went to further education college um, around the age of 18, and I was the only disabled student in the school, and that was horrific. I was very shy. I wasn't prepared. I was institutionalized by special education, long term rehab hospitals. I've written about that before. So, but you can't just then place someone that vulnerable into a further education college of noisy 17, 18 year olds. It was horrific. It was not great.
Yeah, and I think judging by the experience of some of our Young Together 2012 artists, not enough has changed. And I think I come back to I completely get where you're coming from about not being stereotyped and not being restricted to non-fiction, even creative non-fiction like this piece. But people need to hear our stories. They need to learn those lessons from the past, don't they? This the whole concept of bridging generations. Our lives should not be invisible. Our experiences should not go unrecorded, but we need to learn from them. And I'm still struggling to understand how we've ended up with such a segregated education system after 40 years plus of campaigning for inclusive education. We seem to have a worse system had when we were younger. How is that even possible? And now they're sort of saying, oh, well, of course we should be going for inclusive education. And you think, yeah, but disabled people were telling you that for the whole of the sort of last quarter of the 20th century. We thought that was supposed to be policy. Where did all these private academy chains come from, making huge amounts of money out of taxpayers and producing a completely segregated experience, which of course you can understand why parents think is the best option, and it may even be the best option, but it shouldn't be the best option. The best option should always be your local school with your siblings.
And I feel it's a nice segue into something else I did, which was over Christmas, connected to UK Disability History Month, and the Royal Literary Fund, who support me with lots of things and are a great organisation. And I feel a small part, but hopefully a reasonable influence in opening that door, if you like, and bridging that gap to what the disabled experience is. So I got commissioned to write for the Bookseller, which is one of the biggest magazines of the industry in the world. I was very delighted to do that, but that was pointing out that there is very, very little work out there in terms of published, anything, novels particularly, that fully explores a three-dimensional and contrary experience of disability. And by that, I mean, we're not talking impairment narrowing or whatever. There is a slight, because my agent, I'm lucky enough to have an agent, but she's found it quite hard for publishers to get over their nervousness. It's, touch wood, it probably sounds, some people might attack me for saying, oh, it's wishful thinking and you're clearly not good enough. And we've always had that. There's always that. And I'm sure other excluded groups and communities would know that. Well, you're not published, you're not good enough. It's not like actually you're not published because people are scared to publish you. Why are they scared? Because they might lose money. And
but I think beyond that, it's, there's so many stories of best-selling authors having their books turned down again and again and again because people don't want to take a chance on a new writer, whatever they're like. So the idea...
It's worse than ever.
Yeah. Absolutely. The idea that the writing isn't good enough, it just doesn't stand up to scrutiny, because you see all these other people who've had the same experiences. I think one of the, again, looking at our sort of recently acquired status as seniors, is all of these times where we've been the first and knowing that you're not going to be the last. I think I was the first disabled person to have significant funding from Wellcome Trust, and they've funded some amazing work since, which is great, but it doesn't stop it being very lonely for us and difficult.
No. Because... And I agree about Wellcome, by the way, because they've commissioned some of my they did a great thing last year about disability in nature, and they commissioned me to do something about that theme, and it was a beautiful piece of work. I was so proud to do it. I was able to use photos that my dad had taken. They took some slides and transparencies and they put them on the piece. They cleaned them up. I'd love to share that together as well. And just about how you interact as a disabled person to nature as a wheelchair user. But I did that through the eyes of my father, how that led me to see nature, experience nature as a child. So I think, again, it is places like the Wellcome that maybe have moved on quite well into giving a space, but it's still not easy. I still find it hard to know what to write for some of my regular pieces, because you can't keep banging on about the government are terrible, the government are terrible, this year's government are terrible, last year's government were terrible. It's got to be deeper than that, and it has to be more nuanced. And this brings us right back to bridging generations and just the
And
absolute.
visibility, because I think what
Yes,
none of these people are, none of these publishers are taking into account is that at least 1 in 4 of us are disabled. And in terms of readers, nobody's ever really looked, how many readers are older people with age-related impairments? How many readers are disabled people or people with long-term health conditions? How many people are carers who are reading a lot?
but
And
it's
they're
also, yeah.
interested. And there's just, oh, people aren't interested. And you think, well, which people?
Yes,
People
yes.
and why? And again, it's that cyclical nature of, if you've never heard of what happened to disabled, yeah, if you've never heard what happened to disabled children under the Holocaust, you may not be so concerned about them being segregated. But it's
Absolutely.
relevant. Of course it's relevant.
And even down to, because I'm a member of Society of Authors, which is technically my union and professional body. And there's, we have sort of contradictory views there. It's all very, polite and balanced, which is great. Lovely bunch of people, because there's a disabled authors group. But at the same time, a lot of those people aren't remotely politicised. And that makes it quite a difficult space for me, because I want it. I want more disabled people to know they can write, and I want that story to be told. Whereas some of the work they do, and it is very valuable work, don't get me wrong, is for disabled people who want to write anything. Of course, they should be able to write anything. I'm anti censorship. But the point is, you need the balance, because it's like, how will you expect to get a more accessible publishing industry if no one within it, no one disabled, can actually access it at all, whatever level they're doing, whether they're writing children's stories about their favourite cat, for instance, doesn't matter. There's still so many barriers. But I must say, Ju, before I forget it in my mind, so much of this is about profit making.
I
It's
think
about
it is, but it's also about, as people always talk about the purple pound, it's not seeing us as people with any money, with any spending power. It's not
I
seeing.
don't. I think it's, yeah. I just think it's bigger than that. You could say, why did people ever read, um, about gay experience? Oh, because there's gay people in society, and you could apply that across it. But the point being, it's not just going to be disabled people who enjoy reading us.
Well, no, absolutely, and I couldn't agree with you more. But it's just that even if you stereotype it as only disabled people will be interested in disabled fiction, well, there's lots of us. There's
Yeah, yeah,
lots
yeah.
out there, and we're a target. We're almost like literally a sitting target for
And
the.
also, I think that on that as well is that partly then you're back to the money driven model, in that, which I've experienced very directly, is I cannot get, I don't have enough resources. I'm on benefits still. I'm still on benefits, partly because it's limited what else I can do than write. And I can't pay for decent PR. And do you know what publishers very rarely do? They expect authors to do it, and they also expect authors to pay to do it. So then you're again at an immediate disadvantage. There are things now, partly through Society of Authors, etc., and probably other places do it, where you can put an access rider in. I can ask for an access rider to go in my contract. And even when I'm doing spoken word, I can do that now. It's an expected policy. That is improvement, and it's really helped me.
Right. I mean, when you were talking, it reminded me, because I've in a different hat, literally. I've got a small press publishing company, and I remember going to London Book Fair about 15 years ago, specifically to attend a panel where they were looking at a project where they'd been really working very hard to get images of disabled children into books for disabled children. And they described the process of, pictures coming along and sort of going back and saying, well, can you not put a frog plaster on somebody in the nursery? Can you not put a hearing aid, child in a wheelchair? It was only the picture books. So it was like, oh, it's brilliant. You can see your child represented in fiction until the age of 7 or 8. And I
Yeah.
wanted to come back to your piece, The Dark Door Opening. And when you talk about the other thing that Miss J gave you was a real sense of you as somebody who was clever and
Yeah.
right, and
Yeah.
how important that is for our young people to be empowered to know that they can do things.
I think it's essential. And I feel a great sadness when I come across younger disabled people, and I know quite a few in Hastings who are at least below 30, which is something. And I'm always shocked. Anyway, like even disabled people of any age, and they might have acquired their impairments late, which then they're still like just so thrown to the wolves of society, where most people I know in that age group don't know what PAs are. They don't know what direct payments are. They don't know it's a right to ask for direct payments. They don't know that locally we do have a good solid group of people on direct payments, etc., etc., and what that actually means to them. Now, because another one of my passions is the independent living movement, which has been so savaged. But at the same time, if you know how to hang in there and use your rights under the law, it's still worth going for. It shouldn't be like that, but it is. And I also think it ties in nicely in a fairly grim circle back to Bridging Generations and back to my piece, in that you almost end up thinking, well, what do people want to do? What do they want? Who do they think disabled people are, and what do they imagine they want to do? And we could, I won't go too much into assisted suicide, although they are linked, of course. But it's almost like, again, there's such a gap of awareness, and then that will be back to the media controlling that and how we want it to seem. It's back to the euthanasia arguments, in that how it's presented is not how it really is for those who live it. And I think that's dangerous.
The difficulty is that we're facing a law that says it is a rational choice to prefer to die than to be disabled, even if that robs you of 6 months of time with your family and friends and your career and everything else. I think, again, coming back to the Nazis, it's often easy to forget in Holocaust Memorial Day that all of these euthanasia policies started with the Americans. The eugenics, the forced sterilization started with the Americans. The warehousing people in institutions for separate sexes all started with the Americans. And it really struck home to me when the current president took office and there was a helicopter crash. And oh, well, no wonder the helicopters have crashed. They've started employing people with restricted growth. Only, of course, he used a much more rude word. They've started employing people with psychiatric problems. And then there's this constant refrain, oh, if people with psychiatric problems are homeless, they should be warehoused, they should be institutionalized. What we need. And I think we will see on the current trajectory these proposals for new institutions coming in. And I do, like I say, I find it chilling, but I also find, the idea that the eugenics movement is a European movement as opposed to an American movement, that's another thing where we really need to sort of draw back, give our sort of history a good old dust off.
There's a lot of interesting debate and examination to be had around that, because, of course, the other aspect, there's always the history of eugenics is so filled with unexpected names, if you like, including, I believe, I'm going to have a brain blip now. The builder of the NHS, I can't remember his name.
Hi, Bevan.
It might be Nye Bevan, but he actually was a eugenicist but almost in this weird common sense approach, which you do come across a lot. In the so you can fight for the common good and the development of social justice or social care in this case, but you can still think that some people are better off exterminated. And I've come across that a lot. There's been and of course you get it in all kinds of societies and cultures and backgrounds where this is okay because it makes sense, or it seems to make sense on paper. But then when it comes to the crunch, opinions evolve and change.
You say in the Dark Door opening about right wing, what's happening on social media now and in the street, the kind of rise of the right. And, coming back to what I was just saying, the rise of all the disableist slurs from people like Elon Musk, on social media, and being able to use the R word, politicians using the R word, it's all escalating in completely the wrong direction. And again, I think to hear, we need to know not just our stories, but the stories of all those children who died and all of those adults who died, who left nobody to speak for them.
Yeah.
It seems to me that, particularly given your own history of activism, that Miss J did a wonderful, wonderful thing.
Yeah.
And I know the number of children in schools who are commemorating Holocaust Memorial Day has drastically dropped off. But I'm not sure. I think it's a very difficult issue to engage with
Yeah.
children. And I think this day and age, you wonder whether she would have dared to be so graphic. Instead, parents complaining, how dare you tell my child?
No, I thought that. I actually thought that. I spoke with a few people about that because I felt like even the fact that she used to take me to her flat to have tea, and when the other kids could still go horse riding, there'd probably have to be that couldn't be done randomly now. There'd have to be a sort of intricate process, and maybe partly that's correct, but also it was a lovely thing. It was a lovely human thing, and I think that's what I wanted to get across to that. I didn't know what being Jewish meant. I didn't know what the 6 Day War was. I didn't know who were goodies or baddies or any of that. All I knew was I trusted Miss J, and she told me a very powerful and terrifying thing that she felt I needed to know, and I did. Of course, I did. And I imagine she's not alive anymore. I think that she would. I mean, she could be, which is amazing to think about because she can't. She can't be. If she's as old as my mum, my mum's 89, and she's still strong and and sparky. My mum, but I just feel one of my other teachers I'm still in touch with, which is another chance for another day, who was my English teacher when I was a bit older. But yeah, I feel like sometimes I joke that it's like the Hollywood kind of cliche that you have these people, but it's so much more than that when they give you something that saves you, that you take with you for the rest of your life.
Yes, I mean, and I think, teachers, I think, are more valued under the current government, but they've faced so much
Yeah.
this century. There's no, but of course we need to be and supporting teachers. We should be supporting teachers to find safe ways, legal ways to share these stories and to make young people aware.
I mean, one last thing I will say, partly because I was recently the victim of online disability hate. But also, and I'm quite tough with that because of my work. I get that maybe once or twice a week. I get some comment, or it just goes on a page. I can normally catch them and I skim them off and I weigh them up because I haven't got enough energy to deal with these people. Generally, it depends on how bad they are. But I just don't know whether we're going to be able to control what younger people see, blah blah, on their phones and whatever. But every now and again, because I try and maintain my social media presence, because I have to do it in this environment where we are trying to be successful creatives. However, I even yesterday I had a look at TikTok again, and I'm not really. I think eventually I will have to big up my TikTok because more businesses are on it, more publishers are on it, and it's the format that's rising in use, particularly with the falling off of X, thankfully, and the horrific grok. Even just a half-hour dabble into TikTok, there's some horrific things on there, some really horrific things, and I don't know how they're monitored or screened or presumably. I mean, and what I mean is what I would call disability baiting, where disabled people are vilified, they're attacked, patronized. So even which is what happened with the thing I was involved in. The guy said, "Oh, it was only a joke, haha," but it was not nice. But what does that actually mean? That's like, yeah, you can say that from your privileged position. It's here we go again, like attacking people who you know nothing about. You have no right to attack, using abusive terms you have no understanding of, blah blah blah. And what gives you the right? I will always name and shame you as well. I'm not really. I'm too old and venerable to be bothered. Oh, hang on, that's Alexa.
Alexa responding. I mean, I think one of the massive issues, or the massive issue, is if you've got the richest person in the world and the president of the biggest, richest country being so overtly disablest,
Yeah,
it encourages everybody else. And I think, unfortunately, as we all know, it's not just on social media. I'm permanently shielding, so I really don't go out. And I have still been filmed at my gate by a car with two men in it, really making huge efforts that me and my friend knew they were filming us, so the phone was as far out the car window as they could possibly get it. They were jeering and laughing and catcalling. The police said to me, "Well, do you have any footage of it?" And I said, "No, but they do."
yeah.
Boy, but I know colleagues that together, who can't go out without being filmed.
Yeah,
And, there's always been abuse in the streets, but nothing
yeah,
on this level. And the idea that you have you have publishing platforms. I remember the days when you couldn't put a poster up for a band without putting the name of the printer on the poster legally, because that was the law, and the printer was legally responsible for anything you said that might be wrong. So the printers had to check everything. And you just think, how did all of that just get completely shredded? How is it possible that hate speech has been redefined as free speech?
what I will say though, Drew, it is very, to end on a more upbeat note, if
Please
you
do.
like, is that we are also victims of the fact that we don't hear the other side, because the mainstream media forces, the mainstream media voice doesn't really escalate profit or attention. So you end up not knowing about that. I would say all the friends I've got that are below 40, below 35 even, and we might be in a bubble, but it's a nice bubble. They will call out, these are non-disabled younger people, they will call out, not just in connection to me, but generally. Hastings has a strong social conscience anyway, but they will call out the use of the R word, for instance. I've got a couple of friends who are kind of well known for it now, and they will always support me if I post about it. That the amount of love me and Kev had was extraordinary, in the hundreds, with the hate crime thing. That which again gave me a reality check. You just don't get to hear that. That won't get on the main headlines,
Yeah,
sadly.
and
And I think that we all know lovely people.
I
We
love, I mean, I really like what you're saying about this is young people in particular, because again, it's that back to bridging generations, isn't it? You
Yeah.
know, for all of this, you know, it's like I spent a lot of my life as a different generation, and suddenly I was redefined as a boomer. I think you'll probably fall slightly into the same category because I was born after 1960. So in theory, you know, people who
That's when I was born, June, 1960. So I
we
think
did
I'm on the cusp. Just it's
well,
weird,
we
isn't it?
now it was now redefined as anything up to 1965. So
Oh,
I feel like,
really?
you know, we're a generation with a sort of huge age range, but I think we're, you know, I think despite all of this okay boomer stuff, I think the reality is that most older people are much more connected to younger people now than they've ever been in the past.
Yeah.
And I think if we can empower young people with our stories and, you know, as role models, then we have got a much more hopeful future than perhaps we've made it sound, or I've made it sound. So,
No,
I mean, I've loved this style of writing, and as I love all of your writing, and I know other people
June.
want to read more. Where do you know, you've mentioned Byline Times and Substack. Where do we find you on social
You
media?
you can find my website, which was updated last year, and on that you'll find everything. My links to Substack are on there. In fact, what's really funny, I do joke about this a lot. If you type in Penny Pepper Writer, I pop up on Google and it says public figure. And I always say, I wish the pay was better. Or the return, if you like. So Google's decided I'm a public figure, but I still struggle to get my fiction published. The irony, you know. I do have a novel out there at the moment on what we say on subs with my agent, and some of the early sort of responses to that have been very encouraging, but it's still early days. And everything I do will go out on social media. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Blue Sky, which I think Together's just joined.
Yeah, well, a
And
few months ago, definitely. So
yeah,
is your website pennypepper.co.uk?
it is.
And
Yep.
are you basically at Penny Pepper everywhere else?
I'm either at Penny Pepper, like in Instagram, it's Penny Pepper Writer or the Penny Pepper Writer. I've got a Facebook, yeah, professional page, which is that Penny Pepper Writer, and most things are all linked one way or another, in that sense, so people can find me. I'm always delighted to hear from people, and I'm always open to suggestions for commissions and talks. And I'm a little more stable health wise, particularly looking for, you could cut this out later, Drew, but I am looking for talent management. Oh, it's just, I need
Oh,
talent
no,
management.
I think I should leave it in because it's very,
Um,
it's, I think your range of your talents are very clear. And the commission, you know, this commission for us, I just think is so powerful and so important. So I
I'm
just,
very proud of it, Drew. Very proud of it. But obviously, I'm like, even at my age, I'm still like an untapped source of these things. I will never ever stop having a story to tell, even if it's a terrifying and horrific one. That I don't think my story about Miss J is horrific, but what she had to relay to me was, and that is important.
and I
So
look forward very much to reading your next piece. Thank you
thank you,
so
Drew.
much again, Penny.
Thanks, Drew.